the playing Indian phenomena is 4 centuries old, right, as Deloria points out. And so beginning in about, I think the first companies that I looked at that were doing Native American DNA tests were around 2002. I think many of those companies have passed out of existence. And so at the time 23andMe emerged, I was not anymore looking at these companies, but I followed them around a bit in the early 2000s. And so what you had were primarily the people buying genetic ancestry tests are people who don't have any lived connection to Native communities. So they're racially identified in the United States as usually either white or black, and I can talk more about that. A lot of that is about particularly in the east of the United States and the south, where you had massive Indian removal in the 19th century, where people are living and growing up without Indigenous communities in their midst. They are the ones more likely to take the tests and make those claims. Where I grew up in rural South Dakota in a reservation border town, this is a red-white racial divide. There's whites and there's natives. And there are no white people who want to pretend they're an Indian on a reservation border town, so they're not the ones taking the test. So you have these different forms of racism that happen, right? The explicit, in-your-face, violent racism of a reservation border town, and these more implicit forms of racism that are erasure, that seem more multicultural, that seem liberal, but they're all related. So that's who's taking the genetic ancestry test that you will see on Ancestry.com. And I'll just say one more thing before I wrap up. Tribes in the United States, many First Nations in Canada do use DNA testing now, but it's not this kind. It's DNA parentage tests, so what's called the DNA profile. And those are not tests that look at your ancestry 10, 20, 100 generations ago. Those are tests that tell you who your parents might be, who your siblings might be, and those are used because of these, misattributed paternity is what I call it, right? So often when you have a question in somebody's genealogy, and we do genealogies in order to enroll or confer citizenship within tribal nations, it's often paternity that's in question, right? And so that's when a DNA profile test will be used. But one of the things that we do in my tribe and a lot of other tribes in the United States, I'm not sure about Canada because all this stuff is kind of hush-hush when you're talking about enrollment stuff. We will also accept an affidavit from 3 members of the alleged biological father's family, claiming that offspring as one of their kin, or we can do a DNA test. So we do have ways of using DNA on a case-by-case basis if we need it, but we're also looking for ways in many cases to consider these more social kinds of forms of kinship. And so my final word on this is, I think this is much in line with what Susan was saying, our forms of kinship across these kind of cultural and racial lines are very much biosocial. So you have to look at the entanglements of our knowledge of biology and our actual social practices. And so I'm somebody who, while I've been really critical for a decade and a half of the privileging of genetic ancestry and reckoning Native American identity and kinship, I also recognize that biology is a piece of the puzzle, but we need to be really mindful about how we are foregrounding that biological knowledge and also be respectful and consider our long-standing social methods of doing kinship and family as well. So I'm sure there's a lot to talk about in Q&A. Thank you.
That you were featured in a program we did on this a couple of years ago on the 180, and the title was "Sorry, That DNA Test Doesn't Make You Indigenous." And I want to quote you back to you right now, because I'd like to explore something that you said during that story. You said it's not just a matter of what you claim, it's a matter of who claims you. And I wonder if you could sort of dig into that a little bit more depth to explain within the context of these 23andMe and Ancestry CA DNA tests, what exactly you mean.
Well, I think what a lot of Indigenous scholars, and I actually took that quote from Chris Anderson, who wrote the book Métis, and he's our dean at the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. He's Métis. He's from, I think, Prince Albert. Is that in Saskatchewan? Mm-hmm. I'm still learning my geography up here. But it's a quote I take from Chris, and I think it's something that's kind of permeated throughout the literature in the last couple of years. It is about family, but it's also, he's really alluding to the idea of being a citizen of a nation or a member of a nation, right? And so this is the thing that gets lost on a lot of people that don't have close proximity to Indigenous communities in the way that we do belonging and the way that we do citizenship. A lot of non-Indigenous people are thinking about us as a racial category, right? And often as an ancestral category that they can claim as individuals because they have the money to buy a DNA test or the time to do a genealogy. And they're not really thinking about that Indigenous collective, that tribe or that First Nation or that Indigenous or that Métis community exercising the power to claim or not claim them. So it really is taking agency away from Indigenous collectivities and claiming that agency for oneself as an individual. And I know people think that they are simply doing nothing more than often recreational genealogy or looking to find out who they really are and exercising this kind of individual human right to find out knowledge about themselves. But that's pushing up against our rights as collectivities to determine who our citizens are. And I'll say about Elizabeth Warren, she later clarified when she really began claiming this ancestry, it was obvious in her discussions of that she didn't have a clue about how Cherokee citizenship worked. And then later on, after she's challenged by successive Native writers and policy people, she begins to back away from that just in the last year and say, okay, I never claimed to be a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. What I claimed was ancestry. But what happens is you can't separate those two things because in the larger American and probably Canadian imagination, ancestry is synonymous with being Indigenous or being a member of a particular tribe or First Nation. For us, it's not. And so what they're doing is privileging their definitions, which are partly overlapping but not synonymous with our definitions, and we really want to privilege our definitions. But this is what happens in a settler state, right? Settlers get to determine the parameters of racial definitions and categories. We didn't have a lot of say in that, and so we're still in that moment where Indigenous people are not having their definitions of our kinship and citizenship and national identities respected, and instead these other kinds of definitions are being imposed upon us. And so that's kind of what that's getting at, right? If we're not claiming you, it's not simply your right to claim to be us.
And there's another point here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but these DNA tests, they don't say Dakota or
No.
Inuit, they say Native American. And
Yeah.
it's,
They shouldn't give tribes. There is no scientific basis for that.
so if you want to take that, the Native American version of the Irish holiday,
yeah.
and you find out you're 28% Native American on your 23andMe.
So with Elizabeth
ancestry
Warren's
test.
genetic ancestry test, there's been a lot of conversation around this because Carlos Bustamante, who's the Stanford genome scientist who was advising her, and he was an advisor to 23andMe, Carlos mostly works in Latin America, and so his data sets are mostly from there. Native people in the United States have shown themselves to not want to be sampled, so there's a dearth of Native American samples in these data sets. So he's working in Latin America. Now, of course, we're all genetically related, right? And so you can have a scientific debate about how applicable those markers are to helping her claim Cherokee ancestry. But because we share these markers and higher and lower frequencies, as Susan indicated, throughout the Americas, what we're calling Native American markers, they don't point to a particular tribe. I mean, you could go in, if you wanted to go into the Cherokee Nation now and sample, first of all, scientists would have to go in and do a decent sized sample of all of those who claim to be less admixed. Well, most Cherokee are highly admixed. They're going to show ancestry from all over the world, right? So it's really going to be hard to get a representative sample, number one. And then we know in tribes or Indigenous communities across the continent, we have many, many lineages. I mean, I have a Turtle Mountain Chippewa great-grandmother. I have Cree and Métis ancestry. I have Dakota ancestry. I have Cheyenne and Arapaho ancestry. Which of those tribes are you going to privilege if you do a DNA test on me and you find my Native American markers? Who do those belong to? So and that's how it is for all of us. So they should not be attributing them to a particular tribe. That's simply not science. You can't determine that through these kinds of. I think what happens is the geneticists who are going out and sampling Indigenous populations are not understanding how much we mixed and moved around, and I always use mixed with scare quotes, both pre and post contact. We have not stayed in one place. We have mated with different kinds of different populations around the continent. So how do you decide at which pinpoint in biogeographical time you're going to say this marker belongs to that tribe? And then tribes come in and out of existence, right?
Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thanks.